from Whitney Media, 1460 WVOX, The Greenberg Report, with Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner. You can join in the conversation at 914-636-0110. Now on 1460 WVOX, here's Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Good morning, Westchester. I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenberg Town Supervisor, and we have a really interesting non-political show today. My guest is Julienne Ryan of J. Ryan Partners, and Julienne is a speaker, a storyteller, a trainer, a facilitator, and a coach. She's also the chair of Stories and Organizations, National Storytelling Network. And she wrote an interesting book, Learned It in Queens. Welcome, Julienne. And maybe you could start by just telling us a little bit about yourself.
Hi there, and thank you for having me. I always laugh when I hear people reading my book title. Long title, I should say, and a short little book that's all about learning about our communications and what are we doing to get ourselves in trouble when we're on our digital devices, and how to do a couple of simple things that'll make it better. So thank you.
And what inspired you to write the book, and why did you highlight Learned It in Queens?
Okay. So the book started its life as a complaint when I was working and doing a lot of people watching in New York, and I realized that humans had mutated into a heads-down, living in a bubble species. Everybody was on their digital devices. Nobody was really paying attention. And I was also eavesdropping and listening to conversations, to be quite frank. And I found we're all guilty of making some assumptions. And I started to pay attention to how I was reacting even on my emails and things. And the title came about when I was asked to talk about this topic about digital communications a few years back. I went to a large conference. I thought I was going to just be speaking to 100 people in a room down a hallway somewhere. And then I found out I was going to be addressing about 500 people standing on a big stage in front of a supersized screen. And I had a really reaction to say, oh, my God, what am I going to talk to these people about? They're going to hear my accent. They're going to say, why is that woman standing there? You know, she's not famous. And out of that, I reacted and said, you know what? I'm going to keep it authentic. They're going to hear my accent, and I'm going to show up as I am and have some fun with it. So the title came from that, and then also my editor told me I need to make sure I kept something practical in it, which is making sure I inform them about the digital communications, because that's huge in our world right now and how we're working with it, and it's so much part of how we interact with everybody every day.
And where could people get the book?
Oh, Amazon. Amazon.com. That was the central place to buy it at this point in time. I do show up at some talks around New York, or they can write to me. But Amazon is the best resource for that.
You do a lot of storytelling, and you're a facilitator and a speaker. Was this your first book?
Yes, it was. I had been doing storytelling, and shout out to the Theater Young Youth Center, because that's where I did some writing workshops with Golda Solomon, who's a poet, and at the Arts Westchester. And I always was noodling around with storytelling and using it to create some engagement in my workshops with folks. It builds trust. And we learn lessons from each other when we use storytelling.
Is writing a book much harder than being a storyteller?
That's a very good question, because part of the challenge when I wrote the book is I had done a really successful speech. It was well received. It made people laugh. And figuring out how to bring what worked on the stage to the page was the challenging. Like, how are people going to be introduced to the topic that I introduced to an audience in the space of a few minutes? So it was. And then as the editor that I reached out to and we worked together, he gave me some really good guidance as to think about the book in a fresh way. The topic made sense. the playbook points that I use for guiding principles make sense, but step away and create a new dynamic. So it's what I learned basically is you have to ask for advice, make some mistakes, keep trying, and keep doing things in new and different ways.
That's great. I guess the more what's sort of like one of the best advices you could give to somebody who wants to tell a story?
Very good question. First of all, tell a story about something that means something to you and it resonates, because stories tell a certain truth. And if it's something that doesn't mean a lot to you, it's going to come across to your audience, whether it's on the page or whether you're giving a talk to somebody. You're not going to be authentic. People are going to sense that you're really not invested in the topic. The other thing about that... Okay.
Let's take a 5-minute break.
Okay.
And then we'll be back in 5 minutes with Julienne Ryan. I'm Paul Feiner, Greenberg Town Supervisor.
WVOX. Now back to the Greenberg Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, my name's Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenberg Town Supervisor. We have a really interesting program today. My guest is a speaker, a storyteller, a trainer, a facilitator, a coach, and an author, Julienne Ryan. And we're going to start. We have a phone call from listeners. Good morning.
Yes, hi. How are you? I'm delighted to be continuing the conversation about my book and the work I'm doing to bring people together, one story and one authentic conversation at a time.
Great. So, how are you? Couple quick questions. First of all, I love the fact that you were listening into people's conversations. I do the same thing sometimes.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. You can learn a lot.
You can learn a lot. Two quick questions. One, could you share with me what part of Queens that you come from? And earlier in the show, you said that you have an accent. What type of accent do you believe you have?
I definitely have a Queens accent. I grew up in the Hillcrest section of Jamaica, Queens, right before St. John's University, a little off Union Turf. Yeah.
Do they still got that good Chinese restaurant on the corner?
No, not anymore. But anyway, but there is a lot of great Chinese and food, and that's a big part of our borough, to have amazing food and have conversations.
But can I just say, well, that's why I think like Queens is the greatest community in the world, because the food that you could get, the different foods, is just phenomenal. But let me just say this. There is no such thing as a Queens accent. There's a Brooklyn accent, but there's no Queens accent. We who grew up in Queens have no accent. The rest of the world may have an accent.
That's what we think. First of all, the way we say our EHs, like here, there, and where, I was informed that I had one way back when I was 16 years old, and I was visiting my brother's college upstate, and that was the first I had a realization about it. Secondly, I think one of our hometown heroes, which is Christopher Walken, also said because we live and rub elbows with so many people from different parts of the world, we're always trying to figure out how somebody else is speaking their English. So when you listen to Christopher Walken's speech patterns and how it has a halting lilt, that's where we get it from, because I grew up in a neighborhood where most of the people weren't from here. So it really informed how I speak and how I do my phrasing. And we also like to talk. So do you, by the way.
Can I just say this?
What, love?
No offense to your relatives upstate, but they are the ones that don't talk properly.
Absolutely.
And you just made the point. We in Queens, well, I live in Westchester now, but back in the day, we had the influx of people coming into our community, so we talked what the world talks like, which is the only way to talk. And look at it this way. All those people living in Florida and California just transplanted New Yorkers, so they talk like us, too.
Well, it's great because one of the things I always love when I go out to the borough or I get together with is I did a lot of learning, and that's one of the things in the book about sitting down at a kitchen table with somebody else and learning from their family, learning about their food and their perspective. And I think you can have a much more robust conversation when you're looking eye to eye with somebody. So I think as we're creeping out of the way we've been living for the last 2 years, I think finding those moments to really share food, share conversations, and talk to people who are different than ourselves and do some learning. That's the big thing. Now, you're going to know this word that I had to teach people and work it, to find your front stoop. So create front stoop moments. So do like we used to do in Queens, sit on our front steps and figure out ways to have conversations with people that are alive and not just text and digital.
As a storyteller, you would sit on the front stoop. As a Queens boy, I would play stoop ball.
Oh, so did I. My brother taught me.
There you go. Okay.
I never heard.
It sounds like a phenomenal book, and I think you know, growing up in Queens is going to give you the. It has to be a great book.
Yes, it's short and funny, and I use it every day for myself because it helped. I did it as a picture book to help us interrupt what we're doing and maybe getting in our own way sometimes. So it was meant to be fun, but it had lots of lessons packed into it.
Well, that's fantastic. Good luck with the book. Paul,
thank you.
Thank you for having such a wonderful guest.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Could you remind people the name of the book and where they could get it?
Okay. It's the Learned It in Queens Communications Playbook. The subline is Winning Against Digital Distraction, but you can find it on Amazon with my name, or if you just put Learned It in Queens Communications, it will pop up. And it's, like I said, a short little funny book with pictures to help us figure out how we can talk to others and enjoy those conversations and be much more productive.
And your name again is Julienne Ryan, Julienne, Ryan. I just want to make sure that people who are searching spell it correctly. When you were talking about front stoop moments, I hadn't heard that expression before. Is that something that people in Queens are familiar with, or is that something that you created?
I created it. Stoops are what the Dutch used to call the front steps, and that word stayed with us in Brooklyn as well as in Queens, even though everything keeps changing all the time. So that's one word that got worked into our vocabulary. The front stoop moments was my expression that I came up to kind of capture that ability, whether you're sitting next to somebody or you're meeting somebody on a live phone call like we're doing right now, or getting together on Zoom, you can create really personal and authentic moments using your story and doing more listening than talking, which is sometimes the hardest thing we can do, is train ourselves to listen and really listen, not figure out what we're going to say next or how to interrupt somebody, but really and truly listen. It's a skill that we can all always strengthen, like athletes.
Right. So basically, when you're on the front stoop and you see people passing by or stopping, you really are just learning a lot about the way people act, and you could find humor in anything.
Yeah, and the reason I use stoop is because when I was growing up, I used to watch the neighbors on the street. In the evening, they would gather, hang out, chit-chat, maybe, share some food. It was a great place to people watch, so it's always been a visual prompt for me and something that really resonated with me. So how can we create that in our own lives here? I have front steps in my house in Westchester. I live in Hartsdale, but it's a little different, but I still feel like if we can take a chance to just talk to somebody, be curious, and take an interest, magical things happen. And if we bring that into our classroom, in the workplace, it's amazing. Like this afternoon, I'm facilitating a story workshop with a group. They're going to be talking about their wins, of what really went well in their organizations.
Great. We have to take another break, just a little shorter, and we'll be back with Julienne Ryan, and we're going to be talking about her book, Learned in Queens. It's an ebook.
1460 WVOX.
Now, back to the Greenberg Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, my name's Paul Feiner, and my guest is Julienne Ryan, who wrote a book about Learned It in Queens. And Julienne, as we mentioned earlier, is a speaker, a storyteller, a trainer, a facilitator, and and a coach. And I wanted to ask you what writing the book taught you. Does the experience of writing a book, sort of change your impressions about people?
Well, writing the book taught me about being braver and asking more questions, and then the power of collaboration, because sometimes we think a book just happens on our own. I wrote it, but the way it came about also afterwards to get it to completion was really collaborating and getting people's feedback and collaborating with an art director and just having fun. And there was a lot of stops and starts at the end because especially I was writing it during COVID where people couldn't finish their parts of the work, and looking for opportunities to maybe change something and add something to the book was the gift at the end of the day, because I was able to use a picture that my brother had shot about food that I thought about, and then we added an introduction, a closing, some closing comments at the end that wasn't there that really worked. So I think it was just being patient and having some fun, and like I said, keep asking for help and listening sometimes when you get some good guidance, and stepping back. I think that was the biggest lesson, stepping away from the thing that's so precious, that's kind of your baby when you're writing the book, and listening to the guidance and like I said, taking some chances. I never thought I'd be writing a book about Queens in this way, in the way I approached it, but it ended up being the best decision I ever made.
Great. Some of the illustrations are really, fantastic. There's one that I liked was the digital overload side effects. And,
yes. I made the Queens my sidekick, and I turned... The digital overload was about all the words and all of the things that are constantly flying at us every day, that we are interrupted and disrupted, and we're always struggling to kind of keep track of our messages because they're happening 24/7. But my favorite picture out of the whole thing is the big angry dude, which I kind of did a play on the 1950s time, the old horror movies. And he's kind of the inner guy that gets really angry when a communication doesn't go right. And it's been served as a thinking prompt to slow down, take a pause, remind ourselves that we're writing our own scripts in our head when we are reacting to something, and asking ourselves, is this really true, or I'm creating a situation that doesn't really exist? And that's when you need to pick up the phone and have a live conversation and do some more listening.
Right. And are there some good techniques? You mentioned, I think, in the preface of your book that you needed a hook that would allow you to present challenges in fresh, entertaining ways. So when you're speaking or when you're writing a book, you have to figure out a way to capture people's attention.
Correct. And like I said, that's why I did the visuals, because we're very visual people, and it's the thing that really helps us learn. Nobody has time to look for a PowerPoint or a big book textbook when they're in a situation. I wrote the book so the pictures can be visual prompts, and the playbook has some basic lessons that or prompts of what to do, like keep it authentic, our thoughts are not reality, things that can really remind us how to disrupt maybe the mood we're in and what we're getting ourselves into trouble and try a different tact. So it's about slowing down and listening and having a little sense of humor, because none of us learn by being yelled at. We really need to get creative in how we navigate what we're doing.
Now, Queens and I guess also Greenberg, there's a multitude of nationalities, and what are some of the key suggestions you have that would help people develop relationships with different nationalities and also communicate better?
Well, one of the reasons I moved to Greenberg was for those reasons. We had sidewalks, which I love, and more communities. I think showing up to things and taking chances to go to events that you might not normally go to, different national events that are in abundance in our community, trying different foods. That we have a lot of independent markets up and down Central Avenue and on the different. Show up and meet the owners and find out about the food and how it's used, and just take some time. We are really lucky in our area for that we get to experience a lot of different nationalities and backgrounds in a really small area.
Right, and you also had a great illustration in your book, a picture of 169th Street and 81 Avenue, and you said this was closest to your original home, and you make the point that it's important to remember where people came from, where you came from.
Yes.
And, why is that important?
Well, it is, and one of the things that came out of the book was a gift that I had for myself. I got to appreciate the lessons that were there. There were challenges. There were things that I learned from others. And the more we can learn to appreciate ourselves and start to like ourselves, the better off we are when we're starting to deal with other people. We have much more patience. And I think part of the book is about finding ways to connect and sitting down and talking about those backstories. I learned a lot from young women I grew up with that came from Cuba. And by the time I sat at the kitchen table with their mothers and they kept translating for me, I realized every parent was worried about their kids going to school and doing well and doing the right thing. And when I went home, I was like, you know what? These folks have as much in common with me as anybody else. So I was able to really learn some good life lessons along that. And I think the abundance of international effect makes us think differently and leaves us open to new ideas and new ways of doing things. I think that's part of the beauty of us.
Great. One of the problems with technology is that it enables people to do things rashly, senselessly, be impulsive. And do you have any advice on ways we could avoid doing something stupid using technology?
Absolutely. I've always taught that when I was doing HR is put things in draft. If you do anything, if you're reacting, it's time to put the phone down and not respond. And then really go back and listen to the message. Listen and read the post. Chances are it's you or me overreacting. And all the time, pick up the phone and have a live conversation, or go on Zoom and look face-to-face with eye contact, because it just makes a difference. We are writing our own script, and we don't have enough detail. We need the body cues and the voice cues to really help us sort through our communication. So that's my biggest advice. Take a pause.
Yeah, sometimes when I get an email from a constituent who may be angry or yelling, I just respond, but I forget to put I delete her or his contact information, so I respond and then I never send it because there's no return address, and that gets me out of trouble.
Well, you can say. Oh, sorry. It's hard. I know I'm interrupting, breaking my road, but I was going to say one of the thing is to also acknowledge I received your thing, and then we'll circle back. But when you're ready to have, a regular conversation or an email that you can put some thought into, and I'm sure you go through this quite a bit in your work.
Definitely. I also think that it's, like you said, it's important for people to stop and think before they do something, dumb. In terms of technology and litigation, do you have any advice on how people could, be more careful?
Yes, I mean, I think when you're talking about litigation, I had to deal with that a lot on challenges at work. I think people, again, it's simple things. It's people overreact and they put things in writing that they will regret later on forever. And I think we're sometimes so in a time crunch, or we have expectations that we're putting in our head of what the situation calls for, that going so fast sometimes creates some issues. So I think being patient and really questioning.
Right. We have to take one final break, and then we'll be back with Julienne Ryan. And we're going to continue talking about her book, and Learned It in Queens. And it's a book that could teach you a lot of great lessons. So we'll be back in a couple minutes. I'm Paul Feiner, Greenberg Town Supervisor.
Once again, here's Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Good morning. I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenberg Town Supervisor, and I'm very fortunate to have the chance to be speaking with Julienne Ryan, who wrote a book, Learned It in Queens. It's a great book that I think a lot of people would enjoy reading. You also talk a little bit about food. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I do. Food is a great way of me luring people to meetings and workshops when I was doing training, and I always found that was where people got more relaxed, and they found something in common they could talk about that was really neutral. I do want to circle back to something you asked me right before we had a break there, like what can we do when there's tough situations where things could get litigious or uncomfortable, and I think it's preparing and not being reactive. So learning how to give feedback, whether it's online or in person, is really important, and using somebody that, like myself, or somebody that can give some guiding points of how to phrase things and how to work with a situation. And the more uncomfortable you are, the more you should be preparing for a conversation and just thinking about it, and then using some really good questions to find out if you are making assumptions that are totally off the charts and not right. But yes, back to your question right now, food does help. A snack, a coffee, just spending the time to listen and pay attention. And it's a starting point. And if you want to have a tough conversation, sometimes go into a neutral place. I used to always guide that when I was working internally in HR, and I still do. Find a place to have a cup of coffee, a drink, or just, even a snack. And it can de-escalate a situation and do more listening than reacting.
How long did it take you to write this book?
Oh, my goodness. I started many drafts because, as I said to you earlier, I had to figure out how to take what I had done on the stage to the page. So the first part took a long time, like 6 months. And I had breaks in between that life and work interrupted. But when the lockdown started, I was like, if this is not an opportunity to focus and get this done, I don't know what is. And then serendipity happened. I ended up having, the way I found my editor was a conversation I had with 2 fellow storytellers that work with organizations. And we were discussing about what we're going to do because we're not showing up in person, and our presentations had stopped for the moment. And the friend shared that he was an editor in his prior life and a journalist. So it was like the right person showed up at the right time and the right personality. So now I have someone in Ohio with the Queens accent because in order to write the book, I had to teach him how to say certain things, and there's a glossary in there. So it's quite hilarious. There's a whole tribe of people in Ohio that do a pretty good accent at this point.
I thought that one of the most interesting, chapters or sections was you had a Queen site primer, and
yes,
you have different sounds, and I never, until I read your book, I never appreciated the Queen's accent. I'm familiar with the Brooklyn accent, but I wasn't, I never paid attention to the Queen's accent. For example, you talk, forget about it. Did you know? I mean, it's how'd you get it there? It's something I really pay attention to.
Yeah, we're coming into our own. We're getting much more attention, ladies, at borough, so I'm very proud of that. And it's so funny because I do a lot of listening when I'm meeting up with friends from my old neighborhoods and schools, and I'm like, okay, there's something else I can add to my talk the next time. So, yeah, it's the real deal. Everything I write in that book is true. There's nothing fictional in that sense. It comes from real life and real learning, so that's part of the gift of this whole situation.
You had a interesting visual about parking a car in Queens, which could be a nightmare for some people. And you said getting the most out of your conversation is like parking a car in Queens. You better not tear off a bumper making your point.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on that?
Well, first of all, the reason I started using Queens is just confusing, even for us who grew up there. Queens started as a bunch of farming communities and villages that got smushed together as we became incorporated. So the place was never designed to make sense, and most of us get lost if we're exploring another neighborhood, even with the GPS system. So that was part of the analogy. And then parking is a nightmare there. So you have to be very strategic and patient, and everyone is always planning their exit or entry into Queens. And I didn't realize how much I appreciate parking lots up here till I go back and visit Queens. And you have to build in extra time all the time when you're out there to find parking and leave the place and find where you're going. So it's just crazy.
And you also mentioned, and it's true, I never really thought of it. It's really confusing because, like you said, roads stop, they reappear, they repeat. There doesn't seem to be down the project. There's a 32nd Street, a 32nd Avenue, a 32nd Court. So it's difficult to get around unless you're familiar.
Yes, and then just it makes us tough. It made us resilient, and just had to have a sense of humor because that's the only way you're getting out of that borough in one piece.
Right. Are there like any celebrities who grew up in Queens that you think our listeners should, could learn from?
Well, Cyndi Lauper grew up there, and she's a powerhouse of a producer and songwriter and just such an independent thinking. John Leguizamo grew up there, and Jackson Heights, and ends up being a comedian and actor. We just lost Tony Bennett, who was this phenomenal, who grew up in Astoria. I mentioned Christopher Walken. So there's a couple of, and there's a lot of musicians that came through there and lived there. Louis Armstrong lived in Corona for many years. When he was famous, he just lived in a regular neighborhood and built a very nice house that's now a museum. And there's tons of artists and musicians have come through. There was a whole jazz culture that I only started to realize later on when I left the borough that was there. So it's worth exploring. It's fun things to go. I recommend anybody who's looking for something to do to go to the Queens Museum and look into some of the historical events there. We've got a lot of good things going on over there.
It's interesting because sometimes, I see people who moved out of the town of Greenburgh, but they grew up in Greenburgh and, they could be living in Hawaii or Colorado or Florida, and they still say to me that they consider themselves still a Greenberg, person. Since you grew up in Queens but now live in Hartsdale, do you still consider like your prime loyalty Queens?
Yeah, I'm always saying I'm a New Yorker, and Queens is what informs my experience, even though I've been living up in Westchester for a long, long time. And it is our identity. Where we come from always shapes our experiences and how we think and work, and it was a really nice gift. Like I said, that diversity, that complexity, that just confusing place delivered up a lot of lessons that I'm only now starting to appreciate and share and build into my work. Yeah. And I'm always reaching out to more people, too, now with other authors. And we're having a greater sense of a lot of the talent that came out of that borough. That's unsung heroes, basically.
And are there similarities? You mentioned diversity in Greenberg. Are there other similarities? Sometimes it's interesting because there could be villages within Greenberg, and the personalities are like so different. When I go to Hastings, and then you go to Dobbs Ferry, it's like a different world sometimes. Or Irvington. Do you find a lot of similarities between Hartsdale and Queens, or is it just totally different?
It's different. I mean, obviously we have more green space, we're less congested and everything, but what I always love and found is, like, I keep going back to food, is all the small independent markets that we have, that you can travel the world by just shopping, from Italian to, Indian markets to Albanian to Mediterranean to Chinese markets and Jamaican markets. So I think that's the thing that it speaks to my heart a lot. And then the arts, that there are artists and writers from all over the world living here in different neighborhoods, and that's a big connecting factor for me. I go down to the Blue Door Gallery when I have opportunities or participate in their events. We have the Westchester Arts Center. You have the Theater Young programs. So it's any place that you can mix it up and show up. And the library. I mean, what a great offerings our library has. So I can't say enough good things about where we are.
Terrific. We're running out of time. Could you maybe just tell us again how people could reach out to you?
They can reach out to me by email, jryan@jryanpartners.com. I'm on Facebook. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm always posting articles, etc. And the book is on Amazon, the Learned It in Queens Communications Playbook. And if you Google me, you'll find me, because I've been showing up and giving talks quite a bit, and visit my website as well. So there's always something happening, and I'll be giving more talks in the next few months.
Great. Well, I really want to thank you for joining us. I learned a lot. I loved the book. I thought that it was very creative and funny, and it's like easy reading. So I just want to commend you for what you've done, and I think people would enjoy reading the book. And
listen, thank you. And just let's keep reaching out to each other, one good conversation, a story at a time, and keep it authentic, and listen more and talk. Okay.
Thank you. I'll see everybody on Paul Feiner.
All right, bye.
Supervisor.